Invasion Audiobook, Parts 4, 5, and 6. Part 4. By the time that Sergeant Richardson and Colonel and Lieutenant Colonel Larson made it back to Fort Meade, they'd been massively perplexed at all the power having had gone out, staying out their entire journey. The clock was ticking, unbeknownst to the men. It was 12:50 a.m., and chaos had begun to reign across the nation in earnest, even as the men had entered the post. Reverberating roars of artillery and missiles, as well as airdropped and launched munitions of all sizes and types, could be heard before the end of the first hour had even taken place. Refugees in the Cap region, fleeing the emerging Trojan shock armies, were inadvertently headed towards the Cap City through no fault of their own, seeing as it was literally the only safe direction to head towards, as Trojans closed in for their main objective. Upon first clearing its militarized hinterlands, there was already a handful of installations ringing the city, which needed to be taken first. From their jumping off point, the CCP farm from which Private Lee Chung and his battalion emerged, his company being only one of 8 which formed only their battalion, of which there were 16 battalions that comprised the 92nd Infantry Division of the 31st Group Army. Already by midnight, they'd already taken to the roads, moving to I-95 southbound. People's Armed Police units from north of where they'd started were busy clearing the area's civilians behind the advance of the 31st Group Army's large subunits, which were now on the move. Private Lee Chung was the gunner on the W-85 heavy machine gun, a 12.7 by 108 millimeter weapon. Men, look sharp, look alive. You're about to make history. This will be the defining moment of your entire lives. Never mind careers, yelled the squad sergeant over the intercom of the Type 63 armor personnel carrier. Lee had great anxiety, watching his sector to the left side of the column. 1 hour in, and only one incident wherein an American civilian with a rifle had seen the convoy and took literal pot shots at the shadowy appearing gunners in their hatches. From about 170 yards, barely able to see them, only due to the light from the myriad of stars, could he seem to make out the silhouettes of the Chi-Com vehicles and gunners. Upon this having had occurred earlier, the man had been gunned down promptly, only serving to heighten the alert status of the gunners and alert the nearby Americans of the ensuing invasion. Obviously, in a situation such as this, many got the hint and fled, with mostly only the ones doing so on foot having any real sort of chance at escape. As vehicles were lit up on sight, viewed as potential threats, and thus deemed as legitimate enemy targets. Lee's unit, his company, wasn't the only company having had engaged hostiles within our number one. All others had also, as the initial shock and speed gave way to tiny skirmishes with brave, albeit reactionary fools who lacked any sort of actionable intel on the enemy, their unit types, equipment, or even capabilities, nor viable or effective means or weapons by which to actually make any real impact on the invaders. Things got interesting upon turning onto I-95 southbound, as assisting in the objective number 1 for 92nd Infantry Division of the 31st Group Army of capturing Fort Meade, came other battalions of theirs, some 4, down I-270 southbound to hit it from its western side, as the rest of 92nd ID from I-95 to cover the east end, namely its other 12 battalions, of which Private Lee's Mechanized Infantry Battalion was a part. American refugees, having had fled ahead of their advance, warned the gate guards of the approaching invaders en route to take refuge in the Cap City. Thus did some, though not all, of the troops there have an opportunity to sign out their weapons by the time heavy air and artillery, as well as missile strikes, began to come in and hit very hard. That much of the post was in total shambles and rubble by 1 a.m., 1 hour in. By 2 came the Club K salvos, which now brought the whole affair and advance to 3 a.m., Lee's battalion now beginning to engage an American battalion attempting to flee the area via crossing the interstate, only to run into Private Lee's battalion, originally to be the last on the highway, meant to be used as a sort of ready reserve to be sent in as reinforcements later. But in war, plans change, and the battalion was now locked into a savage life-or-death encounter. The Americans attempting to flee the complete and total terrain denial air and artillery strikes upon their former positions in the installation. The American battalion was at the northernmost end of their forces of the 704th Military Intelligence Brigade. No communications, no air or artillery, or heavy weapons support of their own, apart from some small stocks of AT-4s and, of course, crew serve weapons such as the M250 cal machine guns. "Contact, right!" snapped Private Lee, as loud as his voice could manage. He and the rest of his company, minus one man staying oriented to the left to watch their flanks, began to rake the roadside woods with a devastating mix of 12.7 millimeter machine gun fire. Also, 30 millimeter and 100 millimeter shells from their company's 4 infantry fighting vehicles, their ZBD-04s. With their APCs, which were the Type 63s, their gunners laying down the machine gun fire, along with their headquarters platoon's MRAPs, which were Tiger MRAPs, and even from a machine gun mounted on their recovery vehicle, with even the company's mechanics within embroiled in the thick of the fighting. Lee's bandolier of rounds was beginning to run low as he let it ride against a roadside home off the highway that he seen through his night vision goggles, about 300 yards away to the west. "Getting low! Need another can!" yelled Lee over the intercom of the armor personnel carrier against all of the noise of the machine gun. He felt something bump his leg. Looking down, he grabbed the ammo can and did a tactical reload of his W-85 machine gun, staying low beneath the gun shielding itself. Having already had been hit multiple times, leaving small dings and dents in the rolled steel armored plating. The zings of bullets cut through the air, piercing noises that left those on the intended receiving end know that they were perilously close. "Drop the hatches!" commanded the squad sergeant over the intercom, having had received the order from the sergeant first class, who himself was given the order to pass down from the company captain. The men all emerged, having been told to conduct a left-oriented rolling shield maneuver, as in to face right or to the west. Right away, Chi-Com rocket-propelled grenade copies, Type 86s, were deployed, as were barrel-mounted grenade launchers on some of the QBZ-95 rifles. One of the company's 4 lieutenants beneath the captain, the head of the company, called in a precision airstrike from the squadron of JH-7 ground attack planes pre-allocated to this sector to support the ground forces. One of the PLAAF's mid-air refuelers had been tasked to the area in order to ensure the air power in the region stayed a constant pressure upon the enemy forces, especially on day 1, the make it or break it day, that would set the tone of the whole invasion. Being the same squadron that had just struck Meade was still in the area, in mere minutes, one broke off from its squadron nearby, one of the JH-7s, and swooped down, dropping one of its remaining 2 1,000-pound munitions directly on a grouping of forces on the other side of the highway, with one of the several homes on the west side of the thoroughfare being lased and then destroyed, leaving a massive cloud of dust and debris post-shockwave. Lee was almost stunned by the terrifying surge of power of the blast, never himself having seen anything like it so close. Indeed, it was a danger-close precision airstrike, but it did its intended task, thereby wiping out 370 enemy troops of the American battalion in one single devastating blow. Unbeknownst to they who called it in, of course. However, be that as it were, by this point, there still remained some 200 left scattered about, still causing trouble for Lee's company and whole battalion overall. As this was a battalion on battalion battle, more or less, completely unexpected by both sides, encountering each other in the so-called fog of war, quote unquote. Reeling from the intensity of the blow, the Americans began to fight as hard as they could because their lives completely and totally depended on it. Came the shot and immediate blast of an 84 millimeter recoilless shell of an AT-4 anti-tank weapon, crashing into and destroying an APC. One of the Type 63s of the 4th Company, which was the company immediately south of Private Lee's company on I-95. This was the whole battalion's first vehicle loss, of course. The gunner was definitely KIA'd, but the driver WIA, or wounded in action. Watch out for those SOBs with the anti-tank weapons. Kill on sight, top priority, came the order via Lee's headset. This came direct over the radio from the Sergeant First Class himself, from his armor personnel carrier in the row of vehicles. Lee didn't know how many men he had cut down thus far in the ensuing firefight, but judging by all of the silhouettes of bodies strewn about in the dark, he could only assume that he had contributed an ample amount to the loss of life. He continued to lay down bursts on the wood line, raking the hillside and tree lines, and now rubbled husks of what were once people's homes. By now, all the dismounted infantry forces bounded and covered, charging up the hill. As Lee had been given the ceasefire order, but to stand by in case of need to provide any potential necessary covering fire for the dismounts, who for their part fired or tossed grenades, barrel-mounted or hand grenade, respectively. Surges of concussive waves leaped up from the ground as they detonated, throwing ample debris in various directions. The dismounts swept the wood line in squad-sized wedge formations before returning to remount their vehicles. Lee stayed alert as logistics were replenished from the headquarters platoon's supply MRAP, whereby more ammo had been distributed to replenish the supplies of each vehicle. "Green on ammo!" yelled Private Lee's sergeant into the radio headset upon giving his vehicle and squad's status report. The whole battalion returned to a standby or ready reserve status, told to intercept any more potential stragglers trying to flee the Meade battle barely to their south, still raging as the clock struck 5 a.m. 93rd ID, just south of 92nd ID, Lee's battalion's parent unit, which was the 92nd, was seizing Andrews, the air base, as well as the Navy's Indian Head installation, before all units would consolidate their positions to prepare for the capture of the cap itself. Upon 3 battalions of the 92nd ID taking Fort George, as well as Leesburg in Virginia, with its 2 airports, one being the Dulles International, wherein a PLA FOB was to be quickly established for use in the occupation. Sir, can you hear me? Asked Sergeant Richardson, who himself was bleeding badly. Not profusely, but badly enough that he knew he needed medical attention. Sergeant Richardson crawled toward the body of Lieutenant Colonel Larson. Sir? He turned over the body and seen burned and missing skin and shredded clothing with it. Sergeant Richardson checked his pulse. Nothing. Shit, he thought to himself. I gotta get the hell out of here, he pondered as he rolled onto his side, surveying the damage. The twisted metal that was an LMTV truck, its burning hulk of what it once had been, and the former battalion headquarters building had literally been the only reason why he was even still alive. Having had been just inside the building, which itself had been flattened by shells landing all around the outside of it, with the truck blocking the entryway. He clearly had been knocked unconscious. Even wearing his helmet and armor he had suited up in previously, upon the news from the refugees passing by who had informed the gate guards who passed it down by foot. This due to no comms, no communications, due to the cyber and anti-satellite weapon attacks. Even so, he was at the right place, right time. The moment the barrage and airstrikes came in, Lieutenant Colonel Larson, among so many others, had not been so well positioned, relatively speaking. Facing the entryway, he caught most of the shrapnel, which flew in through the LMTV itself, which caught complete hell from the savage shelling. The building was totally gutted and caved in, all upper floors no longer there, having had pancaked into themselves. Beams and cinder blocks and more littered the hall, to where it was nearly impossible to even stand up completely at this point. The sounds of sporadic gunfire was now heard in the near distance. The enemy was close. And only one other person in the wreckage of the ruined building still was breathing, aside from Richardson. Is anyone there? Coughed a voice. Yes. Can you move? We gotta move now. Richardson obviously had no time to even worry who it was and what their name was. Just the need to get the hell out of there. Are you injured? We got a GTFO now, Richardson urged, while trying to find his rifle to no avail. I'm moving, gasped the other man. You got your weapon? Richardson asked. No idea where it went, he responded, as he was buried under one of the many collapsed beams that barely kept the men from being crushed alive. The rattle-tats of firearms continually kept moving nearer now, with both men moving quietly out of the wreckage, yelling and shooting only growing louder without the rubble drowning out some of its cacophony. The initial barrage did indeed cease, true enough. However, the artillery now changed from indirect to precision strike missions, called in by ground troops wherever they deemed resistance firm enough to be worthy of such a heavy-handed response. Despite the vast size and scope of the barrage and accompanying airstrikes and territory hit by it, there were survivors, or those who were either not in vulnerable positions or out of the main target area when it all struck, who now in vain tried to do their best to resist. Mangled, broken, and shredded bodies and body parts were strewn about in craters and rubble. The whole place was completely unrecognizable from its former memory. Vehicles were charred, hulks of twisted metal, equally tossed about. There were two different groups of men visible, taking cover within the remains of a few former barracks buildings, now reduced to rubbled husks. Attempting to stand up, crouched to run over to the other friendlies, Richardson fell on his face initially, but was hurriedly helped up, with both stumbling across a relatively short 50-yard former parking lot. "Friendlies!" yelled the other men who saved Richardson in the trouble. Part 5. Having had sat there quietly in the truck for now several hours, though both Joseph and Sally were deep in thought, they both listened and watched for any potential trouble, making glances in mirrors and out the windows, neither wanting to be heard or have anyone get the drop on them. Needless to say, Joseph's firearms, all three, were already loaded prior to fleeing town, were in his lap at the ready. By 4:30 a.m., there was still distant blasts, heard echoing from afar, doubtless the result of what by now had been mountains of munitions of all types coming from all sorts of platforms, all crashing into targets as diverse as the size of the world itself. As of yet, no enemies had found their way into the mountains immediately due east of Butte itself, some 7 or so miles away. As both sat there, thinking, they both recognized and it had completely registered the life they knew before that had previously existed was now over. Moreover, to add to it, they understood that they'd never be returning home ever again. By this point, the logistical battalion that began within Butte itself, along with the Chi-Com Cav Scout Company of another battalion, the Recon Battalion, both belonging to the 7th Group Army's subunits, had long since secured the town and set up to ready for the externals, now on their way south from Canada, who'd be arriving roughly by 6 or 7 a.m. at the absolute latest. And of course, other Trojan forces, having had moved in to assist the securing of Butte, the vital crossroads town that it was. By now, motorized infantry battalions of the paramilitary 75th Militia Corps of the Chi-Com paramilitary forces moved through to clear the town prior to then moving further north and east, as per their plans to secure the hinterlands, along with the PLA's 7th Group Army, now largely busy even further east with missile silos and several key installations, along with mopping up of pockets of resistance anywhere they could be found. By 5 a.m., those tasks done by the 75th Militia Corps of the Chi-Com paramilitary elements with regards to Butte were largely complete, causing them to move on to other areas. As the 27th PAP Light Armored Division and the 4th Militia Corps of the Western Montana Prong were reaching Missoula, Montana, and en route to move into their new AO, which they were allocated to, and was their peel-off point to fulfill their specific roles in the massive invasion. Central West Montana, down to the state line with Idaho, was their whole AO, with 49th Combined Arms Army of Russia securing the northern parts of Idaho. As planners realized, resistance realistically would be vastly higher in this entire region, even beyond many other regions, even being as sparsely populated and topographically unfriendly to military forces, even as it were. As 5:30 a.m. rolled around, Joseph quietly raised his hand, as if to say, "Be quiet, I'm getting out." He then did so, opening the door and very quietly shutting it behind him. The hunting rifle and pistol he took along, leaving Sally with the AKM rifle, presumably for her own defense if needed, should he be eliminated and not return. On his 30-06, he had NVG optics, a rail-mounted with an option for a rhino-mounted monocle for either a helmet or firearm, though on his firearm. It was the only NVG system he had access to, and finally decided to use it to observe, checking the area after deeming it relatively safe enough to do so after hours of inaction sitting in the truck. Being that the starlight remained enough to barely see ahead, he crept quietly away from the truck and Sally, his wife. Having moved about 200 yards away up the hunting trail, the truck was sitting on, he kneeled and raised his rifle to observe the woods. He did so for about another 30 minutes before seeing some activity. Off just to the northwest, there was now tons of movement. Human figures. Another roughly 250 yards away, putting them a grand total of 450 yards from where their truck now sit. They were moving southwest, coming from the northeast. As he seen them while watching from the southeast towards the northwest, it resembled an X shape, with himself on the bottom right corner of the X, and they on the top right corner of the X, moving towards the bottom left corner of the letter X. They couldn't see him unless they changed their direction and course. They were armed, he now could see, as they meandered into much better viewing from where he sat. Armed, but didn't look like troops by their movements, and judging by their silhouettes and what weapons he seen as well. No standardization. Civvies? He didn't know. And wanted to be entirely 100% sure before even thinking of making any form of contact with them. Meanwhile, outside of Derby, Montana, to the east, a group of refugees in the mountains sat discussing what had just occurred in neighboring Idaho with people in the area east of Derby who lived there. Bill Glass took in a small group himself, allowing them to park their 2 SUVs in his driveway. Bill was well beyond his denial of the situation by this point, and as he listened to their stories of homes being shelled, vehicles being strafed from the air by either fighters or ground attack planes, most likely upon dropping their heavier payloads on their pre-designated or called-in targets, as well as other types of destruction. All in all, many of these refugees had ran a gauntlet and were literally outright blessed to have even made it as far as they even had, especially in vehicles. Though safe for the moment, that was all about to change very soon. Upon the 4th Militia Corps of the Western Montana Invasion Prong of Externals, along with the 27th PAP Light Armored Division, 2 paramilitary forces of the CHICOM forces, now moving down into the area from Canada. Now it was 6:30 a.m. The 4th and 27th were now in the area, south of I-90, moving through mountain valleys to bivouac for their future further attacks coming to the area, which were set up to occur roughly by 12 p.m. on the 4th of October, which was about 12 hours into the entire undertaking. Though reeling from these blows, including the psychological blows, the hardy mountain people of Montana and Idaho began to consider their next moves. They as a whole realized that their strength of defense lay potentially in the terrain of the mountains, as well as being coupled with the grace of Almighty God Himself. There was a moment of realization occurring. Indeed, that would be spurred on by developments in the area as well. As soon as skirmishes in the towns along Route 93, including Derby itself, which would kick off a full-fledged battle that would lead even to Bill experiencing combat for the first time in his life, as by this point, including once skirmishes along Route 93 had broken out and concluded, masses of people would be headed for the hills and mountains to do their very best in a true war of self-defense, wherein more civilians per capita would resist in just this one area than in most other areas, though not all others. Munitions landing were still heard in all directions, unceasing. Everyone suited up in armor or plate carriers, along with helmets, of whomever wore such, with everyone getting their weapons ready, including those lacking any sort of protective gear, and trying to concoct a sort of strategic defense plan within all various local areas, as there was, as of yet, no clearly defined leaders, though soon they'd surely emerge as the Route 93 skirmishes were about to kick off between the Americans and the invasion forces that would set the tone and stage of the larger battle as a whole within the larger invasion as a whole as well. Part 6. Meanwhile, within Ann Arbor, Michigan, Jacob Robinson and his family of 5 had since bolted behind a group of Michigan guardsmen whose job had been delegated to them of rescuing refugees found hiding from the artillery barrage that had initiated the invasion. By this point, hours into the invasion, the group was trapped in one of several larger pockets of resistance in the city that had since developed and was shrinking smaller and smaller as elements of the 2 Chi-Com PAP light armor brigades and 1 North Korean People's Army mechanized infantry brigade, allied forces of the Chi-Coms, was closing in on them. Rattled off the M16A4 rifles of the guardsmen, returning fire from inside the husk of a former grocery store down the street beyond the parking lot. Came the splash of rounds. Oof! Gasped one of the guardsmen, caught in the left shoulder and then face, likely by a few bursts of return fire from some unseen rubble pile along the streets of what once were buildings. "I know it's time to move again," the sergeant said upon hunching over, checking the pulse of the man who was hit, and proceeding to shake his head as he uttered his words. Despite all the refugees now hiding in the store, as it became a sort of ad hoc collection point for such, were all horrified and being eerily silent, not speaking, most laying face down on the ground, scattered amid pieces of earlier destroyed and caved-in ceiling and roof pieces, and also shelves, many knocked over and even flipped upon each other, and some on their sides entirely. One of the guardsmen ran to the back, to where others were watching the back, to relay the movement order. This, upon already upon it already deemed unnecessary to waste their badly needed aid supplies on what was already a dead man. The one who'd been KIA'd earlier. Bullets were continually flying in, only getting more and more intense as fire now shifted against the store. This due to other fellow close-by American positions essentially having had been liquidated by that point. Without mutually supporting positions in the area, there remain no more reasons to risk staying in such a perilous position, especially with so many civilian lives now at stake. I see them! Here they come! Go! Yelled one of the guardsmen as he fired with 3 others, as the sergeant herded, the rest of the civilians out the back. As the other 4 performed a hasty rearguard action to slow down any advancing enemy troops. Each of the 4 began to do a backwards bound and cover, using shelves and rubbled ceiling chunks as cover. This as they leapfrogged their way one by one toward the back with all the rest, while shooting out the front. Upon going into what was once the alleyway right behind the store, there was another squad, but of different guardsmen who had shown up from some other position somewhere in the area. Most likely the neighborhood on the other side of the alleyway fence, which was on the other side of the back of the store. This way! All of you, follow us! There's safety in the sewers, beneath the city. We're using that to get people out, and to store weapons and food and water. Right now, it's not much, but it'll maybe last us several days tops, if we stretch it. Just then, one of the 2 other troops at the entrance to the alleyway, on the corner of the dilapidated store and the street, pulled out an AT-4 from behind his back. Came the sound of it firing within literally a second. Go now! They yelled, as smacks of powerful rounds now began ripping pieces off of the corner of the former building off of it, coming from huge 12.7 millimeter machine gun fire. Got one of them, but more coming! Yelled the guardsman, running past. Jacob and his family looked like deer in the headlights, operating on very basic motor functioning, moving after the sergeant who had initially pulled them out of their hiding spot near in the back of their home. They had crawled under the broken fence and were the last of the refugees to pass through it. As the civs began to follow the other guardsmen through to the other side, while the others at the corner kept watch and had fired the AT-4 to attempt to buy vital seconds to evacuate everyone from the area through the fence. They continued to move deliberately and tactically through the rubble and husks of former buildings en route to the sewers, whereby there were other troops securing and protecting the chosen entrance to the sewers in an effort to ensure that enemies could be kept at bay for as long as was physically even possible, to help save as many civilian lives as was the ability to. Even as they fell back, others from the rest of the same particularly shrinking or any others from the rest of the particular shrinking pocket were doing much the same. Next time will be further parts of my Invasion audiobook. Thank you all for coming, to all who came.